Hello, Steve Goodwin here with my anchor test video number 135. This will be a continuation of my Bruce anchor scaling study, this time in the Sandy Mud Seabed. Now previously I tested all these anchors in the soft mud and found that indeed the largest, the 50 kilogram model, did have a slight advantage in that soft mud seabed. Specifically, it had a holding power ratio, that's the holding divided by the anchor weight, of 15. The 30 kilogram Bruce had a ratio of 11, the 20 kilogram had a 12, the 15 kilogram was a 14, and then down at the very small end, the 5 kilogram, it had a ratio that was actually higher than all the rest at 25. Don't have a good explanation for that, but it's possible that when you get to the really small sizes, maybe there's a boost there. But for the rest of them, we do see that the 50 kilogram was best, but again, it was just slightly better. Incidentally, in the soft mud, these Bruce anchors really do quite well compared to all the other single tooth, non-pivoting fluke anchors. Of course, Fortress and Danforth do better than any of these anchors in the soft mud. That's where they really shine. But again, Bruce anchors can really hold their own, and maybe we really don't need them to have a big boost. However, in the Sandy Mud Seabed, which is what we're going to look at in today's video, they really do need a boost there because they perform quite a bit less than many other more modern anchors. Now, before we get to the footage and data for the Sandy Mud testing, I'd like to give a brief financial statement. It was the latter half of 2020 that I started accepting donations to help cover these tests, so 2021 marked the first full year of those donations, and here is a rundown of the numbers. I do collect revenue or donations through three sources. YouTube advertising money is one, individual payments by viewers through PayPal is another, and recurring donations through Patreon is the third source. And total, all three of those for 2021 was just under $9,000. So not bad for a hobby. I did conduct I created 36 videos, which was obviously numerous tests and lots of days, and darn near a full-time job. It was COVID times and my day job was a little slower then, so it dovetailed nicely. I did have some free time and spent much of it out on the water and behind my desk making videos. However, the $9,000 didn't go into my pocket, it went out. In fact, I spent over $10,000 in direct expenses for these tests. I'll say that none of that money went into these facilities or the new test boat. So it all went toward anchors. So it was about $2,500 worth of anchors that I bought. There was a couple $1,000s worth of Dyneema. Several hundred feet of Dyneema was bought for those winch tests. The winch itself was $1,000. There was boat fuel. I did not buy a camera last year. That was good. So I went all year without ruining a camera. Shackles, repairs for various things that break. Again, on and on, over $10,000. So certainly not a money-making enterprise. It's still very much a hobby of mine. I'm telling you all this not as a plea for you to send in more money. It's just I like to be full disclosure about this kind of stuff. One effect that the lack of profit that this has is, unfortunately, I will not be able to travel to, say, the East Coast and seek out that elusive hard sand that I just cannot find here. I've also talked about maybe going to the Chesapeake for their soupy mud. About a year ago, I was speaking frequently about my intent to make that trip, but again, money just is not going to allow it. That trip is going to be at least a month. I could see it being $10,000, maybe $20,000 in expenses. Hotels, road fuel, repairs, restaurant food, gone from my work. Again, I'd need to see the anchor test coffer far above where it is. And frankly, I don't think that's going to happen. And again, this is not a plea for you guys to send in money. Certainly you're welcome to, and I'll make good use of it. but this is going to have to just stay a hobby. Unless somehow somebody was to sort of write a research grant or something like that. Again, I just cannot see this progressing past the hobby stage. So let's get out in the water and check out this latest hobby of mine. Again, continuing with my Bruce anchor scaling study. Enjoy. Okay, we'll get things started with the 5 kilogram Bruce Sandy Mud Seabed winch test. This is a test where the boat is immobilized by a large dead man anchor. I pull in with a winch on that anchor, and the test anchor here gets pulled from behind the boat, and we have a load readout in the lower left. We did just see a peak of about 275 pounds, and that was the most the anchor could do. It happened right away, as you saw, within an anchor length. It reached its peak. Never fully buries. We just saw it kind of lifted out and rolled over on its side. It now has a big ball of mud in its hand, so to speak. And once that happens, the performance is severely limited. It'll try to sort of dig in a little bit from here on out, but that's pretty much what you see, anchor dragging along with a ball of mud. Here's a test from more than a year ago. It's just a propeller thrust test for the same anchor, and it's the same story. Anchor never fully buries. I didn't have a load sensor at this time, and maybe it's just a couple 100 pounds of pull. More of a behavior check here, and like I say, once these anchors get a ball of mud in their hand, it usually means that performance is very, very low at that point. This is a fascinating test from, again, more than a year ago. This is where I tested the concept of tandem anchoring. We have a primary anchor on the right, and connected to it via interconnect chain is the Bruce there on the left. And what happens, the primary anchor digs in very nicely. It's a Viking anchor and makes some nice, good holding power. The Bruce anchor behind it also is now buried and adding to the holding power, but you'll see right here, the Bruce is lifting up, and it rolls out with a big ball of mud. So it's doing virtually nothing now. All of this 580 pounds currently is being taken up by the primary anchor. But right there, what happened to the Bruce? It's missing. It's gone. What happened is it entered the trench of the primary anchor, and that trench contained seabed that had been disrupted and was no longer as cohesive. And now the Bruce is like a superhero. It is dove out of sight and is creating a tremendous amount of holding power. If you look back over to the right, the primary anchor is going to emerge from the seabed. It's going to lift up, and at some point here, it will be completely visible and hanging, suspended like a kellet between the primary anchor being the Bruce there on the left and the boat. And the holding power is phenomenal. We'll never see this anchor produce anywhere near this amount of holding in the normal undisturbed seabed. Another factor as to why this is doing so well is part of that initial set when it dove out of sight, it was receiving a horizontal pull. The primary anchor was keeping the road down nice and level, so it had kind of a boost there. But again, this is just tremendous. We're up close to 1,000 pounds. The primary anchor on the right is now fully visible. We see the tip of the anchor above the seabed. So 100% of this 1,020 pounds is being resisted by the 11-pound Bruce. Just tremendous. Unfortunately, this trench has an end to it. And once it gets to the end of the primary trench, it's the same old story. It clogs up in its hand, it pops out, and in this case, it absolutely just flies out of the seabed. So for the purposes of this video, we're going to ignore those super high holding numbers during this tandem test, and I'll just look at that first winch test of about 275 pounds of pull. It results in a holding power to weight ratio of 25. So 25 for the 5 kilogram Bruce. Now we're on to the 10 kilogram Bruce, and it actually does a little better. In spite of having an initial set that was on its side there, it almost fully buries. It's looking quite good there. Still got a list to it, but the numbers go up quite high. Briefly, we are going to see about 760 pounds on the scope there in the lower left, but after that, it does roll out. That does result in a ratio of holding power to weight of 34, And that's starting to get to be a pretty good number. You can survive some pretty good wind with that kind of holding. Unfortunately, the anchor does eventually get the characteristic ball of mud stuck in its hand. The anchor rolls right out and drags along. Now it looks like that ball has partially sort of fallen away, and we get some great images of the anchor trying to self-right as it's being dragged on its side through the seabed. But it doesn't quite make it. It's just really struggling, pretty low holding power. I dragged the anchor like this for many, many feet. It did have a couple of peaks that were higher. At one point it was over 400, but could never get close to that initial 700 plus number. Here's another pull on the 10 kilogram Bruce, this time just using propeller thrust. It's not as good. It peaks at 315 pounds of thrust. That equals a holding ratio of 15. It's quite low. So I'm going to go ahead and average the two. I'll take the 15 ratio and that previous 34 ratio it saw using the winch, and I'm going to rate this one at a ratio of 24. So it's virtually the same as the 5 kilogram Bruce. See that characteristic ball of mud causing its problems there with that pull. Here's the first of two winch pulls for the 15 kilogram genuine Bruce. The initial set here, the anchor had to reorient itself a little bit as the pull was a little misaligned from the initial landing spot, but it straightens out nicely. It's fully upright, and the anchor dives as deep as any of these first anchors that we've seen. It's almost out of sight, and there it goes. I can't see it anymore, so that's very good. And corresponding high pull numbers. So this is a 15 kilogram or 33 pound anchor, and we're going to see it peak here for a brief point at 1,160 pounds. That gives it a holding to weight ratio of 35. It's very good. Remember that the one peak from the 10 kilogram Bruce was 34, so we're starting to see a little pattern there. That's real similar. Anchor, I think, is now listing, holding is back down about 500, 600, and eventually it will roll out. We woke up a crab there that was buried itself in the mud. Didn't seem to be harmed, fortunately. And there it is. Anchor has kind of rolled or popped out with a ball of mud in its hand. Here's the second winch pull for the 15 kilogram Bruce, and like the 10 kilogram Bruce, it had one good pull and one not so good pull, and this is the not so good. It only peaks at about 440 pounds. That gives it a ratio of 13, and if I average that pull with the other, we get an average holding to weight ratio of 24. Note that that is the exact same as the average for the 10 kilogram Bruce, so we're starting to see a pattern here, pretty tight group, both 24. The first anchor we looked at was the little 5 kilogrammer, and I rated it at 25. So again, all three of these anchors seem to be quite similar. Very similar behavior. If they stay engaged and more or less buried, they do good. But once they grab a hold of some seabed and pop out, they really suffer. Now we're on to the 20 kilogram Bruce with a winch test. The anchor does land mostly upright and gets a good initial set. Pretty well buried. Unfortunately, the scope there never gets over about 700, so that's fairly low. The math works out to a holding ratio of 16, and it's backed up by a previous pull I did about 5 years ago with the anchor just being pulled by propeller thrust. But it was a real similar number. It was about 750. So I'm going to go ahead and rate this at 16, so it's a bit lower. Let's say that at least so far in this increasing size of Bruce, we are not seeing an increase in performance. If anything, it is a decrease. Here's that footage from 5 years ago. It is 3.5 to 1 scope, which is considerably less than the 5 we were doing previously, but it's using an all-heavy 3/8 inch triple B chain. And I've done the math, and you actually end up with a more favorable road angle at the anchor with this scope and road combination. So it's a pretty fair test, pretty good apples to apples. Again, only 750 pounds and a rating of 16 for that 20 kilogram Bruce. Now we're on to the 30 kilogram or 66 pound Bruce, and this is the size of anchor that I've heard quite a few people say that here's where these anchors start to shine. The bigger anchors do better, and this is where it starts, allegedly. However, I'm not seeing it in this seabed. It had a nice set there, it's upright, and it's digging in there and looking like maybe it's not going to foul. It does have a peak of 1,100 pounds. That's a ratio of only 17, so that's not the greatest. It's usable in, moderate breezes, maybe some light gales, but certainly not storm capable of holding. The anchor didn't pop out right away. It's kind of hanging in there a little bit longer than a lot of the anchors that were clogging, so maybe there's a little benefit there, but nope, as you can see at about the 25-foot mark, that anchor pops out, rolls over, and that was it. Eventually it did re-engage partially, made maybe about 700 pounds. So I'm going to rate this one at 17 on that ratio, holding to weight ratio. Give it a 17. And finally, we'll look at my largest Bruce anchor. It is the 50 kilogram. It actually weighs 118 pounds on my scale, and by my sensibilities, it is a brute. If big Bruce anchors are going to work better than small Bruce anchors, this is where it's going to have to happen. And I'm telling you, right off the bat, with this test, it does do better, but watch the video till the end. It's not the end of the story. But for this particular pull, it does really well. We can see the anchor just dove out of sight right away. Got a little bit of cracking or a little bit of heaping going on, so the anchor is pushing up on the seabed a bit, but I'm just not seeing it foul. That anchor is just gone. We're not going to see any of it for a very, very long time. And we're going to see some nice high numbers there. Again, it's a big anchor, over 100 pounds, so our ratio here is, say, in the 20s at this point. It does have a peak. Takes quite a while to get there, but it eventually winds up to 4,370 pounds on this particular winch pull, and that is a ratio of 37. That anchor is moving so slowly now, it's possible that the dead man anchor is moving. Certainly that anchor has to move a certain amount to be able to hold against these high numbers. It takes a while to set as well. But no, this anchor does continue to have some motion. We see it moving a bit there, and our holding numbers continue to remain high there, and they're in the 3,000s. And again, they're going to just keep on creeping up. And I cut out a little bit of that. It was just monotonous in the low 3s. Up to 39. There's 4,000. We're going to see the peak here shortly. 41. 42. No sign that the anchor has rolled. It looks completely upright all throughout this whole drag. There's 43. And right around in here was 43.70. That was the peak. Now, unlike the smaller anchors, after the peak, it didn't just pop right out right away. It was dragging for many more feet, slowly decaying, and eventually the captured camera tether phenomena occurred, and it plunged the camera down into the seabed and blacked everything out. Now I'm going to cut all that out and show you the aftermath of that plunged camera, because during that time, the anchor did what must have been almost a 180-degree roll, and here is the aftermath. It is the anchor lying on the seafloor with a very large ball of mud in its hand. Just a perfect visual of that clogging seabed phenomena. Anchor is just almost completely upside down. Now, this is a big, heavy anchor, and it eventually overcomes that mud, and it starts to roll back upright. You see it there. It's about through 90 degrees, and the anchor is able to re-engage after considerable pulling. Looks like a lot of the mud ball has broken away or fallen away now. Again, the anchor must be about on its side, maybe at the 90-degree point, but I keep pulling, and it slowly works its way back close to upright. It never gets fully upright, and it never re-achieves holding power near that initial peak. It does peak about 2,500 pounds, though, at some point, so that's pretty good. The anchor is able to recover from that mud fowl release. You can use that crab for scale. That's a typical Dungeness crab, and they measure, adults are about 6 inches across. And indeed, that Bruce anchor is quite large. The camera tether I've made a little bit longer for this anchor, just so we can see all of it. And the anchor is pretty well fully buried again, so that's real good. Okay, here is take 2 for the big 50-kilogram Bruce with this winch test. Perfect upright landing. It's absolutely just no listing whatsoever, and a nice pull right in the correct general direction. So it's got a break here. It's got a perfect set. This should be good. It should just be able to repeat that other performance, and we will see that it does not. We see a peak of about 2,300 pounds at some point along here. It does have a pop out and it does reset and has a new peak in the low 2,000s. So it does repeat this sort of ability to reset and again making the low 2,000s. But again, that initial peak just was nothing like that first one, about half as much. Let's call the holding ratio of this pull at 19, and if I average those two together, we're going to see a holding ratio of 28. So, does the larger Bruce anchors have a performance advantage in that Sandy Mud Seabed? And I can just say that the 50 kilogram, the largest of all these, seems to have an advantage, although it is not great. Real briefly, we'll go over some of these numbers. The 3 smallest anchors, the 5, 10, and 15 kilogrammers, they were all either 24 or 25 in that holding ratio. The 20 kilogram and 30 kilogram, they were less. They were 16 and 17 in that holding ratio. But in the 50 kilogram, things did boost up a bit. The average between the two pulls was a ratio of 28. Again, the one pull was 37, which was quite high, and then it also had a 19. In addition to having higher numbers, just visually looking at the behavior of these anchors, the larger was the best. It did stay engaged, fully buried longer than any other anchor, and also when it did finally clog, pop up, and roll out, it was able to recover and rebury to a deeper and higher holding degree than any other anchor. So again, it's not a large boost, but I can go ahead and say that yes, this is a better anchor. Now, is it as good as other more modern anchors? No, not even close. Again, let's say this average was a 28 holding factor. I can point to several anchors on the wall here that have holding factors that are at least double that. I think the other big story with this whole series we watched today was what happened with the 5 kilogram Bruce in that tandem anchor bit that I showed you. It's a video from more than a year ago, but as we saw, the small Bruce, it entered the trench of the preceding primary anchor, and once it did, boy, it shot out of sight and made 1,100 pounds of resistance. Again, it's only an 11-pound anchor. That gave a holding ratio of 100, which is phenomenal. If you have a generously sized anchor that's making 100 times its weight, you're ready to face a storm. So it'd be wonderful if all these anchors could do that. And my guess is that all these anchors are right on the ragged edge of working properly in that seabed. And what I mean by properly, diving out of sight, staying dove down, and burying deeply. If they could do that, boy, these anchors just would be top-notch in that seabed. And again, I think they're close, but it's just the nature of the beast. I think these fluke tips, the way they are kind of twisted, I think that helps grab a hold of and catch the mud. I bet you if these things were straightened out, they would probably perform better if they were upright. The trouble is they wouldn't ever get upright if they land on their side. I do believe that these twisted flukes are the key to what keeps these anchors rotating into the upright position. So I'm sure Mr. Bruce had a very difficult time deciding just exactly what the best compromise in terms of this fluke shape. But as we see, it is a compromise. This anchor does suffer in some situations. Okay, that's a wrap for the sandy mud portion of this Bruce anchor scaling study. Next will probably be cobblestone. I have been working on a couple other anchor tests. They'll be coming up. One is a 172-pound Danforth anchor that I have been studying. Also, I now have a 55-pound Mantis M1. Earlier when I spoke about dollars, I did not have a chance, or I neglected, to thank those of you who are sending me your dollars for these studies. So again, thank you very much. For everyone else, thanks for watching, and we will see you next time. So long.